in looking for weaknesses and exploiting it, had two types of isolation. One is individual isolation, and that can either be perceptual or simply social. Social isolation in that they remove you from the others. Perceptual isolation in that they put you by yourself with no sensory stimulation allowed. And that can be devastating. Social isolation, although difficult, sometimes is easier than being with a group, particularly if you are responsible for the group. Now, the other type of social isolation is where you take two individuals who obviously have some type of conflict between them, either personality conflict, prejudice, be it racial or religious or whatever. Take those two individuals who have a problem and put them together. Now, you take any individual, even your best friend, if you are put with that individual for an extended period of time in a closed environment with stress, he's going to irritate you. That's just the way we are. The person will do something, an innocent habit which before had no impact because you didn't see it day after day after day. All of a sudden it's going to really irritate you, and the more he does it, the more it's going to irritate you. Pretty soon you dislike him. Well, if you take two individuals who dislike each other to begin with for one reason or another and put them together, you have an explosive situation. The cadre will do that, and then the cadre will step in between the two individuals, and relative to one another, he looks good. And at that point, he will exploit both of them for propaganda. Whatever he needs, he suddenly becomes the good guy. Now, he'll bring good deals with him. You know, they'll give better food, a little bit better clothing, take you somewhere out of the camp, a change of scenery type of environment. It's a method of exploitation, and they use it effectively. The key there is that you can't let those type of things override the ultimate sense of loyalty. And that's to the other Americans around you. That faith in and belief in the other people, that loyalty to the other people, is a key to our success in Special Forces, in that we work with and we depend on everybody else around us. Now, you know, there's people in Special Forces that we personally don't like. You go around, you'll find somebody that you don't like for one reason or another. We always tried to structure teams in such a manner that we had people who worked well together. All right? You get in a prison camp, you don't have that choice. You work with whoever is there. So you have to take that obvious effort on your own part to ensure that whatever breaches there are, whatever anger is created, you heal it as quickly as possible so that you all work. Because if the VC or any communist organization can fragment the group, then they'll defeat you in detail, one at a time. If you have unity, then everybody is helping everybody. Somebody goes down, you pick him up, you recharge his batteries. But if every man is fighting for himself, you're easy to defeat. And that's an essential.
Also, another strategy that they seemed to use was in your case, I know there were several times that you had an execution date that was set, or also the tactic of some mock execution of another prisoner or someone in your camp. And
again, the communist system is one which raises your hopes and expectations up the top of the flagpole, and then they cut the rope, and everything plummets. They try to get you on an emotional roller coaster. Number one, you generally don't know what's going to happen, so that the threat is always real and it's always there. The pressure is never off. One of the cadre told me early on, he said, we do not necessarily rely on physical torture, because if we use it indiscriminately, we may alienate you from the lessons that we would teach you. And also, simply by controlling the physical, we do not necessarily control the man. But if we can control and manipulate the mind, then we have you. And so theirs is again, a very pragmatic analysis of what will allow them to achieve the results that they want. They'll use physical torture if they have to, but if they can use other subtle pressures, and pressure on the mind is the most subtle because you can't really put your finger on who's doing it to you. Now, The mock execution was with Rocky Versace. Dan Pitzer, Rocky, and I were in a camp. One night we heard a tremendous commotion down by Rocky's cage, and Rocky had been resisting. He spoke Vietnamese and French both. So he took them on in Vietnamese and French. Now, Dan and I dummied up. We just weren't saying anything because we didn't speak Vietnamese, and we certainly didn't speak French. Rocky took them on from day one, so they knew they had a hard case. Well, they moved him out that night. But the next morning when we went down to get rice, his cage was in shatter, just broken, as if a tremendous fight had gone on. His PJs, had given him a set of gray cloth PJs, were ripped and torn, and there was blood all over the cage. The indication was that they had gone in and had slaughtered him and had carried the body out. Now that was used as an implied threat. He resisted. He's gone. We're not going to tell you where he went. And it had an impact, no doubt, had an impact on both of us. Then, I remember one of the guards came down, and he said that if we cooperated with the front, the National Liberation Front, we filled out all the questionnaires and all of that, that we would be released. Everything would be fine. And I said, hey, wait a second. How in the world can we believe anything you say after you killed Versace? And the guard blurted out, nobody's dead. Nobody's dead. And then he realized what he had said. And in the Vietnamese that I understood, one of the things that he said was Mao Luan. Mao Luan. And I didn't understand that. And I asked one of the guards later on, a different guard, what that was. He said, eel blood. Oh. And what they had done was they had killed an eel and bled the eel out all over the cage. Well, at that point, our spirits went back up. We didn't let them know it. But that was what they had done. They had actually staged all of that to psychologically defeat Dan and me. Well, the other thing was that there was always a balance between you're going to be released and you're going to be executed. Well, I was actually on the execution list. It's just that when the choices were made, in the first one, Rocky was first on their list of officers. I was second on their list of officers. The Central Committee decided that an NCO, an American NCO, and an American officer would be executed. So they took Ken Rohrback, a Special Forces NCO, and Rocky Versace, and executed them. Had they said we're going to execute 2 officers, Rocky and I would have gone. The second one, Jimmy Jackson and I were on the list, and the government in Saigon decided not to execute the VC terrorists that they were going to execute. For that reason, the VC did not execute us. So there were 2 lists that I was on, and I knew it. And that sort of makes your heart pump a little bit harder at the time, because there's really nothing you can do. You face it, and you realize there's nothing heroic that you can do. It's not really feasible to escape, and nobody's going to know how you died. Now, the other thing was that the hope of release was the carrot that they always dangled. They said, your release, sooner or later, is based on your good attitude and behavior as a POW and your repentance of your past misdeeds. Now, they would come through all the time and give indications that either a release had been negotiated or that the front was going to make a unilateral release. Everybody's spirits would go up. The day of the proposed release or the period of the release would go past. Nothing happened. Everybody's spirits would go down, and the interrogator or the indoctrination cadre would come in, catching you on that low point. Now, that wasn't circumstance. They timed it.
It's all manipulated.
Manipulated it. And you don't realize it while you're in the midst of it, but when you step back and you look at it, like a sine wave. And so what you had to do was you had to have your own level of expectation and your own emotional level. And you had to hold that no matter what happened. And that was another key, was maintaining emotional control and self-discipline all the way through. You couldn't let them know how they were affecting you. You couldn't let them see what you were thinking, because then they would go in and look for what they needed in terms to defeat you.
One of the tactics also I note from your book was the showing some favoritism for their own purposes to exploit prisoners, and then the charges and counter charges of pitting prisoners against each other with this issue of collaborating with the enemy.
That again was a method of dividing the group, and we use it in our own techniques trying to break prisoners apart, is give the impression that one of them is getting a good deal, maybe for no reason at all, but to damage that person or that individual standing within the group and to isolate him, to have him alienated. If you can do that, then he becomes a prime subject. And if you can get prisoners hurling those accusations at one another, then it simply increases, exponentially. That's what they did in Korea. They did it very effectively in Korea. They didn't do it as well in Vietnam, but it did occur. In North Vietnam, you had the Peace Committee. And there were soldiers who actually said, we are a peace committee. We are taking no orders from the chain of command. They came back and were never charged.
So it was a fragmentation of the body for them to isolate and again exploit people.